America joined the Vietnam War in March of 1965. They sent an overall number of 2,700,000 men and women, 135 photographers, 600 journalists, and 2,699,265 soldiers. Men and women had to leave their homes. They were sent to war just off the results of a lottery. What were your first thoughts when you found out you were going to be sent to Vietnam?
Well, I had just graduated from college in June of 1967, and that was at the time that had the largest buildup in Vietnam of the American soldiers over there. And I enlisted in the Army the same month I graduated from college and started training to become an infantry soldier. And subsequently, I was sent to Vietnam later that year, and that began my involvement with the Army in Vietnam. My feelings about going to Vietnam were fear and disbelief. I couldn't really believe that a college graduate just 1 month earlier was soon to be sent to Vietnam. So I was scared, I was in fear, and because of that, I went around the country and saw every one of my relatives and said goodbye in the event that I didn't come back.
In 1968, Walter Cronkite arrived in Vietnam. He was a reporter for the CBS Evening News. He was known as the most trusted man in America and wanted to see for himself what was really going on with the war and to cover the aftermath of the Tet Offensive. When you first arrived in Vietnam, you were on the front lines. What scared you the most, and how did you transition to being a photojournalist?
Well, what scared me the most was not knowing where the North Vietnamese or the Viet Cong, who were the sympathetic folks in the South that were sympathetic to the North Vietnamese, where they were located. The people in the South, the Viet Cong, looked just like all of the other people in South Vietnam. And because they were very much a guerrilla type of a movement, they could hide in tunnels underground, and we never knew exactly where they were. In fact, our actual base camp was built right on top of the Vietnamese tunnel system in Cu Chi, Vietnam. I was with my unit for about 6 months, and I was in the field with them, and we conducted multiple heliborne assaults on various villages and so on where the Viet Cong were located. And I got wounded in one of those situations, and because of that, I was hospitalized. I was airlifted and taken back to Cu Chi base camp and operated on. And once that I started to heal up, I learned that the Public Information Office, which is the people that take care of writing the news articles and taking pictures, was located just about next door to the hospital. And at that point, I felt I needed a better job than being an infantryman. And because of that, I knocked on the door in my hospital gown to see the person in charge of the Public Information Office. And he agreed to, once I finished healing, to make me the war correspondent for the same battalion that I was with prior to being wounded.
Shortly after Cronkite returned to the U.S., he released a broadcast exposing the awful things about the war and calling it a stalemate. This changed history because it started protests all around the U.S. to end the war. Protests spread wildly once the public was able to see and hear how awful the war was from somebody they trusted. People started debating if America should have even joined the war and why we did. The media so often tended to send negative reports back to the U.S., which made U.S. citizens not support the war and provide valuable information to the enemy in Vietnam. The effects of photojournalism opened a whole new window for people to see the horrors of war. As a photojournalist, what would you say was the scariest mission you ever captured?
Well, probably the scariest mission was an air assault on a dry creek bed where there were rumored to be NVA and VC soldiers located. 500 or 600 people were air assaulted into this particular area. They said it was a hot LZ, meaning it's a hot landing zone. They were taking fire. So we were really scared when we got on the second lift to join them. But eventually, all of the lifts were completed. We were firing our weapons into the area and so on. And once we approached the creek bed, somebody in the creek bed, probably a VC or a North Vietnamese, threw a grenade at our unit. And it exploded not far from where I was and wounded a sergeant, a medic, and also the radio telephone operator, who eventually lost his foot as a result of that explosion. And we were able to clean out the creek bed, and we helped get the RTO, the radio telephone operator, airlifted by a helicopter so he could get treated for his wounded leg.
In World War II, most military photography was taken for official reasons. When World War II broke out, there was only one U.S. Army photographer, Jeffrey Keating, and one cameraman, Harry Rignall. Unlike the Vietnam War, where there were hundreds of photojournalists that had no limits on how far they could go on the battlefields. Because there were no limits, that meant that Americans could see almost everything. The war was nicknamed the Living Room War, in the words of Michael Arlen of The New Yorker. The Vietnam War was the first ever war Americans could watch from their homes on their televisions. How do you think that affected the outcome of the war for the U.S.?
I think it was extremely important. We would see film clips from the war from 24 hours before that, because they had to send the film to New York to be shown on TV. And consequently, everyone in America was watching the 6 o'clock news, particularly Walter Cronkite, who had been a photojournalist in Vietnam. And he was the one that was now the most trusted man in America, they called him. And consequently, everybody believed what Walter Cronkite said, and including me. And he was the one that basically said, this is an unwinnable war. And we learned that from Walter Cronkite, and a lot of people in America started to believe that we never were going to win, and how many more people were going to get killed before we finally left the country. So I think the news media, both the journalistic print news media as well as the television news media, the broadcast media, was extremely important in eventually getting us to leave that particular country.
The Vietnam War was an argument between the Communist government of North Vietnam against South Vietnam and its principal ally, the United States. The issue was reinforced by the continuing Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. The U.S. joined the Vietnam War because they were afraid that communism might spread to South Vietnam and the rest of Asia. Why do you feel that America joined the Vietnam War, and do you think America made the right choice to go and fight?
So I think we made the wrong decision to do that. We're very afraid of communism spreading not just to South Vietnam, but once it spread there, they were concerned that it might also spread to Laos and Cambodia and other Asian nations, and consequently Russia would become a sprawling communist dictatorship across not just their area but other areas of the world, and we were concerned about that.
Photojournalism had a huge impact on the Vietnam War, and some people even believe that photojournalism is what partially led to the defeat of the U.S. As said by the Washington Post, until 1968, network news operations tended to edit out the blood and gore to avoid direct criticism of military operations, while American lives were on the line. The U.S. government had almost no power over what got shown at the news on this point. Then, the Tet Offensive happened. The Tet Offensive was a planned series of attacks from North Vietnam on more than 100 cities and outposts in South Vietnam. North Vietnam hoped that it would encourage the U.S. to reduce its involvement in the war and form rebellion among the South Vietnamese population. Where were you at the time of the Tet Offensive, and how did it affect you and your view on the war?
Well, I arrived in country in May of 1968. The Tet Offensive, as you know, was considered the Lunar New Year. It's January 31st of 1968. And because it was the Lunar New Year for both North Vietnam and South Vietnam, there had been a truce established between both countries that they would not fight over that holiday period. So the North Vietnamese basically decided not to agree to that truce, and they caught the South Vietnamese and the Americans off base because we weren't prepared for them to come into South Vietnam with their troops, and they attacked over 100 cities and villages throughout South Vietnam during that first phase of the Tet Offensive. I arrived in the second phase of the Tet Offensive and was there for both the second and the third phase of the Tet Offensive. But in any event, they basically had a strategic victory over the South because we were unprepared. They gained ground, and we eventually were able to subdue them. But nevertheless, they were trying to show the South how strong they were and that we could be overrun by them at any moment. So it was a strategic victory for the North. Nevertheless, we were able to prevail and chase them out of the country.
The press went crazy over the Tet Offensive, and news about it spread rapidly. But this news didn't lead to the U.S. trying harder to win the war. It actually led to wild protests all around the U.S., which led to the devastating Kent State shooting, and possibly part of the reason we lost the war. The dramatization of stories in the news drastically changed what was actually happening in Vietnam and people's opinions and ideas of what was happening. Do you have a story you could share with us during your time at war that meant something to you?
Probably the story that I would tell is about a night ambush that I was involved in the very first night I arrived at my unit. And I said, well, where are we going? He said, we're setting up a night ambush about 300 yards outside of the wire, meaning the barbed wire around our camp, and that we're going to try to get some VC in this ambush. We set up an ambush site. About 2:30 in the morning, I was handed a starlight scope and said, you're on watch. So I was sitting there scanning the horizon, looking around, thinking, I sure hope I don't see anybody walking down the dike. And as I was thinking that, here comes 6 figures with their weapons strung along their back and bandoliers of ammunition, and they were talking to each other kind of loudly, and they had no idea that 15 of us were laying in ambush ready to shoot them. But they were walking right down the rice paddy dike right towards me until they were about 10 feet in front of me, and I realized nobody else was awake except me. So I started shooting, and once I started shooting, it woke up everybody else, and they started shooting. And finally, the lieutenant came around and said, cease fire, cease fire. I need some volunteers. And I said, what for, Lieutenant? He said, to go out and see if we got anybody. They went out and found the people that had been shot, and they got the papers and the intelligence regarding those papers as to what was planned for that evening by these particular VC. So that was probably one of the scariest moments, and that was my first night with my unit.
To this day, people still debate over why the United States really joined the war and the reason why we ended up with the outcome that we did. Many believe that the press had a lot to do with it. As stated earlier, the U.S. was afraid that communism would spread to South Vietnam and Asia. But there's more to it. It is believed that since there was no limit of where photojournalists could go, we were feeding the enemy information. Just by hooking up to a local United States TV station, the enemy could see our soldiers, tactics, weapons, uniforms, locations, and much more, making many of our attacks more expectable. So this is what led to the debate of, did photojournalism lead to the defeat of the U.S.? What do you believe was the true debate of the war?
I think the debate of the war, going into it as well as once we were in it, was why are we there? And a lot of people felt it was to stop the spread of communism because the North Vietnamese were allied with Russia. Russia was supporting them and sending them weapons, and they were then trying to come into South Vietnam and make them also a communist country and unite Vietnam into one country. So the United States felt that it was appropriate to try to stop the spread of communism, and that's one of the reasons that we were involved in Vietnam.
Photojournalism may or may not have led to the defeat of the U.S. in the Vietnam War, but it has definitely opened the eyes of many to what war really is. Photojournalists captured amazing photos that gave the public an inside scoop on the war. What was the moment you captured on camera that you were most proud of?
Well, surprisingly, the moment on camera, the photo that I took that I'm most proud of, and that picture now hangs in our house, is a picture that I took of our battalion surgeon. His name is Dr. Richard Tesler, and he performed what they called medical civic action programs. And we tried to provide aid to the elderly and the kids and the mama-sans and papa-sans that needed health care. And we thought that by doing that would help win the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people and show a different face of the United States. My picture shows a little girl, probably 6 or 7 years old, being attended to by Dr. Tesler. And he was examining her, and her anxious mother was looking over her shoulder at the little girl and at Dr. Tesler to make sure he wasn't going to hurt her. But nevertheless, that picture that I took, which was just a very lucky picture that I shot, ended up being in a lot of the newspapers throughout Vietnam and the United States to show that particular side of the United States' involvement in Vietnam.
The United States left the Vietnam War 5 years after the Tet Offensive. Both sides negotiated a peace settlement, the Paris Peace Accord. After, the North Vietnamese invaded South Vietnam with tanks and troops and surrounded the American embassy, leading to the few remaining Americans being airlifted from the roof of the embassy by helicopters to waiting aircrafts. To this day, we are still not exactly sure what caused us to lose the war, but we do know that photojournalism has showed us a whole new side of war, and that has changed history forever. Looking back on the war, how do you feel photojournalism changed yours and others' opinions on war in general?
I think the broadcast media and the print media were incredibly helpful in helping form opinion regarding the war. So everyone that watched the broadcast news saw those films, and they started to sway their opinion. And one man in particular, Walter Cronkite, who was kind of the lead broadcast journalism and reporter of his time, was known as being the most trusted man in America. And when he said, "We're losing the war in Vietnam, we'll never win the war, the only way we'll get out is by some negotiated settlement," and that turned a lot of people in America against our involvement in Vietnam, and consequently, many people started to protest why we were there in the first place. Getting back to one of your earlier questions, what was the purpose of us being involved in Vietnam? And they started to believe that the government had made a mistake and that we shouldn't have been there in the first place. So there were protests throughout the country, and that eventually led the government to realizing we probably shouldn't be in Vietnam, and ultimately we had to evacuate the U.S. Embassy with the last few people, Americans, that were trying to get out of Vietnam.